The rain didn't feel like a cleansing thing to Arthur. To him, it was just another logistical hurdle. A gray smear across the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office that overlooked the city. At 65, Arthur had reached a point where he viewed the world primarily through glass. He was insulated by it, protected from the noise of the streets, the heat of the summer, and the messy, unpredictable emotions of people who didn't understand the value of a hard day's work. He sat at a desk made of dark, polished mahogany that cost more than most people made in a year. His hands, spotted with the first signs of age but still steady, moved a fountain pen across a contract with surgical precision. This was his life. It was a life of numbers, of land acquisitions, and of the quiet, sterile hum of an air-conditioned empire. People called him a self-made man, a title he wore like a suit of armor. He had started with nothing, and because of that, he had very little patience for those who couldn't find their own way. That lack of patience was exactly why his house was empty. It was why his phone didn't ring with dinner invitations, only with business inquiries. And it was why he hadn't spoken to his son in over 12 years. The intercom buzzed, sharp sound that broke his concentration. Mr. Sterling. His assistant's voice came through, sounding uncharacteristically hesitant. There is a woman on the line. A Mrs. Miller. She says it's regarding Julian. Arthur's hand paused. The name hit him like a physical blow to the chest, though he didn't let his face show it. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in his office in a decade. Julian, his only son, the boy who was supposed to take over this desk, this view, and this legacy. But Julian had been weak, or so Arthur told himself. Their final argument had been a storm of shouted words in a hallway that ended with Arthur telling the boy that if he walked out that door without his father's blessing, he walked out without his father's name or his father's money. Julian had walked. Put her through, Arthur said, his voice gravelly. The woman on the other end didn't sound like a lawyer or a bill collector. She sounded tired. She told him with a kindness that felt like an insult to Arthur's hardened heart that Julian was gone. A sudden illness, something aggressive that didn't care about a man's age or his unfinished business. The funeral had been small, she said. She was a neighbor. She thought he should know. See, Arthur replied. He didn't ask how it happened. He didn't ask if Julian had mentioned him. He simply thanked her and hung up. For the next 3 hours, Arthur tried to work. He stared at the same paragraph of a lease agreement until the words began to swim like black insects across the white paper. He felt a strange, cold sensation in his gut. It wasn't grief, not yet. It was a sense of incompletion, a ledger that hadn't been balanced. He had always assumed in some hidden, dusty corner of his mind that one day Julian would come crawling back, admit he was wrong, and they would settle the score. Now, there was no score to settle. The game was over. He stood up, his knees creaking, and grabbed his coat. He didn't tell his assistant where he was going. He walked out of the building, his driver waiting at the curb. The municipal cemetery, Arthur said, sliding into the leather interior of the car. The old one on the east side? The driver looked surprised. Arthur usually only went to country clubs or construction sites. But he nodded and pulled into traffic. As the car moved through the city, Arthur looked out at the neighborhoods. They got smaller, more cluttered, and more lived in the further they got from the financial district. This was the world Julian had chosen. A world of chipped paint and laundry hanging on balconies. Arthur felt a flicker of the old anger. Why, he thought. Why live like this when you could have had the world? The cemetery was a sprawling, somber place. It wasn't the manicured, prestigious memorial park where Arthur had bought a family plot years ago. This was a place of tilted headstones and overgrown grass. When they arrived, Arthur told his driver to stay in the car. He didn't want to witness to whatever he was about to do. He stepped out into the damp air. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the sky remained a heavy, oppressive gray. He walked through the iron gates, his expensive shoes clicking on the cracked pavement. He felt out of place. His coat was too fine, his posture too rigid. He followed the directions the woman on the phone had given him, weaving through rows of strangers until he reached a fresh mound of earth. There was no grand monument here, just a simple wooden marker, temporary until a stone could be engraved. Arthur stood before the grave of his only child. He expected to feel a surge of regret, or perhaps a final sense of, "I told you so." Instead, he felt nothing but a hollow, echoing silence. He looked down at the earth and realized he didn't even know what his son's favorite color had been as an adult. He didn't know what kind of music he liked, or what made him laugh. He reached into his pocket. Intending to leave a business card, a habit of a man, only knew how to leave a mark through his work, but his hand stopped. A sound broke the silence of the graveyard. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the distant traffic. It was the sound of a muffled, ragged sob. Arthur turned his head slowly. A few yards away, near a large oak tree that cast a long shadow over the section, two figures were huddled together. They were children, two boys, both wearing jackets that were a size too big for them. The older one, perhaps 9 years old, had his arm around a smaller boy who couldn't have been more than 7. The little one was crying into his sleeve, his shoulders shaking with the kind of prehistoric grief that only a child can feel. In the older boy's hand was a small bunch of wildflowers, the kind you pick from the side of the road. They were limp and starting to brown at the edges, but he held them as if they were made of gold. Arthur stayed very still. He was a man who knew how to command a boardroom, but he had no idea how to handle 2 crying children in a cemetery. He watched as the older boy knelt down, placing the flowers on the fresh dirt of Julian's grave. "Don't cry, Leo," the older boy whispered, though his own voice was thick with tears. "He said he'd always be watching the stars with us. He's just on the other side of the window." Now, Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. Leo, Julian, had mentioned to Leo in a letter he'd sent years ago, a letter Arthur had burned without reading in its entirety. These weren't just random children. The millionaire, a man who had spent 40 years building walls to keep the world out, suddenly felt those walls tremble. He looked at the boys, at their messy hair, their worn-out sneakers, and the way the younger one gripped his brother's hand for dear life. He saw Julian's eyes in the older one's face. He saw his own chin in the younger one's profile. He was a grandfather, and as he stood there in his $3,000 coat, watching his grandsons mourn the father he had discarded, Arthur Sterling realized that for all his millions, he was the poorest man in the graveyard. He took a step forward, the gravel crunching under his foot. The 2 boys jumped, turning their tear-streaked faces toward him. They looked at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity, their eyes wide. Arthur opened his mouth to speak, but for the first time in his life. The secret of Julian's life, the life he had built in the shadows of his father's rejection, was standing right in front of him. Shivering in the rain, the silence in the cemetery felt heavier than the rain. Arthur stood frozen, his expensive leather shoes sinking slightly into the soft, muddy earth. He looked at the 2 boys, and for a moment, the high-rise offices and the multi-million-dollar deals felt like they belonged to a different person in a different lifetime. The older boy, who he now knew was named Leo, stepped slightly in front of the younger one, protective instinct flaring in his eyes that reminded Arthur painfully of Julian. "Are you okay, Mr.?" the younger boy, Sam, asked. His voice was small and raspy from crying. He wiped his nose with a damp sleeve, looking up at Arthur with a mixture of innocence and wariness. Arthur cleared his throat, feeling a strange tightness in his chest that no doctor had ever warned him about. I'm fine," he managed to say. His voice sounded thin to his own ears. "I just didn't expect to see anyone here." Leo narrowed his eyes, looking Arthur up and down. He saw the sharp lines of the tailored coat and the way Arthur carried himself like a man who owned the ground he walked on. "Did you know our dad?" Leo asked. There was no aggression in the question, just a desperate, quiet hope that maybe this stranger had a piece of their father to share. Arthur looked down at the fresh mound of earth, the wildflowers already beginning to look bedraggled under the drizzle. To say he knew Julian felt like a lie. He knew the teenager who argued about justice and art, but he didn't know the man who had raised these 2 boys. He didn't know the man who had apparently lived a full, vibrant life just a few miles away from Arthur's cold glass tower. "I was his father," Arthur said. The words felt heavy, like stones falling from his mouth. The boys went completely still. Sam's mouth dropped open a little, and Leo's protective stance softened into pure shock. They stared at Arthur as if he were a ghost that had just stepped out from behind a headstone. "Grandpa," Sam whispered. The word hit Arthur like a physical blow. He had been called Sir, Mr. Sterling, Chairman, and Boss for decades. But Grandpa was a title he hadn't earned, one he didn't even know was available to him. "He told us about you," Leo said, his voice regaining some strength. He didn't sound happy, though. He sounded skeptical. "He said you were a very busy man. He said you lived in a castle made of glass, and that you were very important to the city." Arthur felt a flush of shame creep up his neck. Julian hadn't told them he was a monster or a man who had disowned his own flesh and blood. He had told them a fairy tale to explain his father's absence. He had protected Arthur's image, even after Arthur had turned his back on him. It was a level of grace Arthur knew he didn't deserve. He was a good man, then? Arthur asked, genuinely wanting to know. "The best," Sam said firmly, nodding so hard his hood fell back. He could fix anything. He could make the best pancakes in the shape of dinosaurs. And he always told us that even if things were hard, we had to be kind. He said kindness was the only thing you could give away and still keep. Arthur looked away, unable to meet the boy's gaze. He thought about his own life, how he had hoarded his wealth, his time, and his affection. He had kept everything and ended up with nothing but a quiet house and a bank account that couldn't buy back a single minute of the last. 12 years. The rain started to come down a bit harder. The boys began to shiver. Arthur realized they were wearing thin windbreakers, totally unsuited for a late autumn afternoon. Their sneakers were worn thin at the soles. Leo's jeans had a patch on the knee that was starting to peel away. "Where is your mother?" Arthur asked, his professional instinct for logistics kicking in. "Is she waiting for you?" Leo looked down at his shoes. "She's at work. She had to take an extra shift because of the bills. She doesn't know we're here. We took the bus. We just wanted to tell him about Sam's math test." "I got a B," Sam added quietly. "Dad promised we'd go to the park if I got a B." Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He looked at the bus stop visible through the cemetery gates, a lonely pole on a gray street. He couldn't imagine these two children navigating the city alone in the rain, carrying the weight of their father's death in their small pockets. "I have a car," Arthur said, gesturing toward the black sedan idling at the gate. "Let me drive you home." "It's too cold for the bus." Leo looked hesitant. He had clearly been taught not to get into cars with strangers, but then he looked at Arthur's face, really looked at it. He saw the same eyes, the same curve of the brow. He saw the sadness that Arthur was trying so hard to hide. "Okay," Leo said, "but only if you tell us a story about him. A story from when he was little." Arthur opened the car door for them, a gesture he usually reserved for high-ranking investors. As the boys climbed into the plush heated interior, they gasped at the softness of the leather and the quietness of the cabin. They looked like two small birds perched in a golden cage. As the driver pulled away, Arthur sat between them. He realized with a jolt of panic that he didn't have many stories. He had spent so much of Julian's childhood at the office. But then, a memory flickered a small, bright spark from the past. "When your father was about your age, Sam," Arthur began, his voice low, "he found a bird with a broken wing in the backyard. I told him we should leave it, that nature would take its course. But he wouldn't listen. He stayed out there for 3 hours with a shoebox and a bowl of water. He named the bird Captain. He stayed up all night making sure it was warm." "Did it fly away?" Sam asked, leaning in. "It did," Arthur said, and for the first time in years he felt a genuine smile touch his lips. He was so proud. "He told me that even the smallest things deserve a chance to reach the sky." The boys listened, captivated. For the next 20 minutes, Arthur dug through the archives of his mind, pulling out every small detail he could remember, the way Julian hated broccoli, The way he used to draw on the walls behind the sofa, the way he laughed at his own jokes. He realized that by sharing these memories, he was meeting his son again for the first time. They eventually reached a part of town Arthur rarely visited. The apartment buildings were tall and crowded, with peeling paint and metal fire escapes. It was a place where people worked hard just to stay in the same spot. "We live here," Leo said, pointing to a building with a flickering light over the entrance. Arthur looked at the building and then at his grandsons. He thought about his empty mansion, with its 12 bedrooms and its silent hallways. He thought about the letter Leo had mentioned, the one from the bedside drawer. "Wait," Arthur said as they started to get out. "Leo, you mentioned a letter?" The boy reached into his inner pocket and pulled out an envelope. It was wrinkled and stained with a bit of dirt, but it was sealed. On the front, in Julian's unmistakable, messy handwriting, were the words, "To the man who forgot how to love. He told me to give this to you if you ever showed up. He said he knew you'd come one day. He said you were just lost, and he hoped this would help you find your way back." Arthur took the envelope. His fingers trembled. He wanted to open it right there, but he knew he couldn't. "Not yet." "Thank you," Arthur whispered. He watched the boys run toward the entrance of the building. Before they went inside, Sam turned around and waved. "Bye, Grandpa. Thanks for the ride." Arthur sat in the back of the car long after they had disappeared inside. He held the letter against his chest. He felt like a man who had spent his whole life building a ship, only to realize he had forgotten to give it a rudder. He was floating in a vast, dark ocean, and for the first time, he was terrified of the silence. "Sir," the driver asked softly. "Where to now?" Arthur looked at the letter in his hand. "Home," he said, "but take the long way. I need to read something." He expected a list of grievances, a lecture on his failures, or a demand for the inheritance Julian had been denied. But as he unfolded the paper and saw the first few words, he realized that the secret Julian had been keeping was far more powerful than money. It was a secret that was about to dismantle Arthur's world piece by piece. The car moved slowly through the city, tires making a soft splashing sound against the wet pavement. Inside the back seat, Arthur felt like the air had become very thin. He held the envelope in his lap as if it were a fragile piece of glass that might shatter if he gripped it too tightly. He had spent his entire life reading contracts, balance sheets, and legal briefs. He was an expert at finding the hidden meaning in a 1,000-page document. But as he stared at his son's handwriting, he felt like a child who had forgotten how to read. He finally gathered the courage to slide his finger under the flap of the envelope. It tore with a crisp, sharp sound that seemed loud in the quiet car. Inside, there wasn't just a letter. There was a small stack of photographs and a few folded-up receipts. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs a strange, frantic rhythm he hadn't felt since his first major business deal 40 years ago. He pulled the letter out first. "Dear Dad," it began. Arthur stopped. He closed his eyes for a moment. Julian hadn't called him Arthur or Mr. Sterling, despite the way they had parted. He had used the word Dad. That one word felt like a hand reaching out across a deep, dark canyon. "If you were reading this," the letter continued, "it means my time ran out before yours did. I always hoped we'd have one more conversation where we didn't shout. I wanted to show you my life, not because I wanted your approval, but because I wanted you to see that I was happy. I know you think I wasted my life. I know you think that because I didn't build skyscrapers or buy companies, I didn't build anything at all. But I want to tell you a secret, Dad. I've been working for you all along." Arthur frowned, leaning closer to the dim light of the car's interior. Working for him? That made no sense. Julian had worked at a community center. He had painted murals. He had lived in a tiny apartment. "I know you have a foundation," the letter went on. "The Sterling Hope Fund. You started it 20 years ago for the tax right, else you told me that yourself. But for the last 10 years, I've been the one making sure that money actually did something. Every month, I sent a small donation to that fund. It wasn't much, sometimes $50, sometimes 20. But I didn't send it under my name. I sent it under the name a friend of the foundation, and with every check, I sent a note suggesting where that money should go. Arthur felt a chill. He remembered his assistant mentioning a friend who was strangely specific about their requests. This anonymous donor had asked the foundation to fund a specific soup kitchen, to buy coats for a specific school, and to repair a playground in a neighborhood Arthur would never have stepped foot in. Because the donations were small, Arthur had ignored them, letting his staff handle the details. "I wanted to see if your money could learn how to love," Julian wrote, and it did. Those coats kept kids warm. That playground gave Leo and Sam a place to play before I was too sick to take them. I was using your wealth to build the world I wanted my sons to grow up in. I did it using the very system you thought was just a game of numbers. Arthur's breath hitched. He looked at the photographs included in the envelope. One showed Julian standing in front of a brightly painted wall at a youth center. Another photo showed the two boys, Leo and Sam, sitting on a bench that had a small brass plaque on it. Arthur looked closer at the photo. The plaque read, "Donated by the Sterling Hope Fund." His son had been a ghost in his own company. Julian had been directing Arthur's resources toward the very people Arthur had spent his life ignoring. "It's the real secret, Dad, isn't the money," the letter continued. "The secret is that I never hated you. I was just sad for you. You have everything, but you don't have anyone to share it with. I wanted you to meet the boys because they are the best parts of me, and they have your stubbornness. They have your chin. If you find them, please don't just give them money. Give them your time. Show them that the man who built an empire also knows how to build a family." Arthur let the letter fall to the seat. He looked out the window at the passing streetlights. He thought about the two boys in the rain, their thin jackets and their brave faces. He thought about his son, working a regular job and then coming home to write small checks to his father's massive foundation, just to guide a little bit of that wealth toward a heart in need. It was a quiet, humble rebellion. Julian hadn't fought Arthur with words. He had fought him with kindness. Arthur realized that while he had been focused on closing the ledger and finishing a chapter, Julian had been writing a whole new book. Julian hadn't been weak. It took an incredible amount of strength to live in poverty while your father was a billionaire, all while quietly using your father's tools to help others. "Stop the car," Arthur said suddenly. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, startled. "We're still miles from the house." "Don't care." "Stop the car." The car pulled over near a small, 24-hour diner. Arthur stepped out into the rain. He didn't care about his shoes. He walked to a payphone, a rare thing these days, just because he wanted to feel the cold metal and the reality of the world. He didn't call his lawyer. He didn't call his accountant. He called his office and left a message for his head of security. "I need the address of the community center on 4th Street, Arthur said into the machine, his voice cracking. "And I need a meeting with the board of the Hope Fund tomorrow at 6 a.m. Tell them the rules have changed." He hung up and stood in the rain for a long time. He looked at the letter again, the paper now damp and soft. He realized that the secret wasn't just about what Julian had done. The secret was that Julian had seen the good in Arthur that Arthur had buried under decades of greed. Julian had believed, until his very last breath, that his father was capable of being a grandfather. Arthur looked toward the apartment where he had dropped off the boys. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of fear. What if they didn't want him? What if he was too late? He had spent 65 years becoming a man of power. And now he realized he had no idea how to be a man of heart. He got back into the car. "Go home," he told the driver. "And tomorrow, get the car ready early. We have a lot of work to do, and for the first time, it's not about the money." As the car sped away, the letter sat on the seat next to him, a bridge built of paper and ink, waiting for Arthur to take the first step across. He knew the path wouldn't be easy. He knew he would have to face the mother of those boys, a woman who probably had every reason to despise him. But for the first time in his life, Arthur Sterling wasn't thinking about what he could gain. Arthur found himself sitting at the head of his massive boardroom table. Usually, this room felt like a throne room, a place where he handed down decrees and decided the fate of city blocks. But today, the leather chair felt uncomfortable, and the silence of the building felt heavy. He had called his top directors in for a 6 o'clock meeting. And as they filed in, clutching their coffee cups and looking confused, Arthur didn't look at their spreadsheets. He looked at the window, watching the city wake up in shades of blue and gray. When the last director sat down, a man who had worked for Arthur for 20 years, Arthur didn't start with the usual talk of profit margins. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, the letter from Julian, and laid it on the glass table. For 10 years, Arthur began, his voice surprisingly steady. This company has been guided by a friend of the foundation, someone who told us where to put our charity money. I want you all to know that the friend was my son, Julian. And I want you to know that he is gone. The room went silent. Most of these people knew Julian only as a name that was never to be mentioned. From this moment on, Arthur continued, we are no longer a real estate company that happens to have a foundation. We are a foundation that happens to own real estate. I want every project we have in the works to be reviewed. If we are building luxury condos where a park should be, we change the plan. If we are raising rent on people who can't afford it, we stop. We are going to find the youth center on 4th Street, and we are going to make sure it never closes its doors again. One of the directors started to protest. Mentioning the shareholders and the quarterly reports, Arthur simply looked at him. It wasn't the look of a shark anymore. It was the look of a man who had seen a ghost and realized the ghost was right. The director went quiet. By noon, Arthur was back in his car. He had a specific address written on a notepad. It wasn't the fancy cemetery or the office. It was the apartment building where he had dropped the boys off the night before. His heart was hammering in a way that made him feel young and terrified all at once. He carried a small bag with him. Inside wasn't a contract or a checkbook. It was a box of high-quality paints and 2 brand new. Thick winter coats, the kind with the heavy lining that could withstand any storm. He climbed the stairs of the apartment building. The air smelled of cooking spices and cleaning fluid. It was a lived-in smell, a human smell. When he reached the 3rd floor, he stood in front of apartment 3B. He hesitated. What right did he have to be here? He had ignored these people for a decade. He had let his sons struggle. He knocked. The door opened slowly. A woman stood there. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes, but she had a kindness in her face that Arthur recognized immediately. It was the same kindness Julian had. This was Claire, the woman who had loved the son Arthur had thrown away. "Mr. Sterling," she said. It wasn't a question. She knew exactly who he was. "I came to bring these," Arthur said, holding out the bag like a shield. "For the boys, and I wanted to talk, if you'll let me." Claire looked at him for a long time. Arthur expected her to scream at him, to tell him to leave, to throw his money back in his face. Instead, she stepped aside and opened the door wider. "The boys are finishing their homework. Come in." The apartment was small, smaller than Arthur's walk-in closet, but it was filled with light. There were drawings pinned to the fridge with magnets. There were books piled on the coffee table. It felt like a home, something Arthur realized his mansion had never truly been. Leo and Sam looked up from the kitchen table. When they saw Arthur, their faces lit up. "Grandpa!" He knelt down a struggle for his old knees and let the small boy hug him. He handed the coats to them, and for a moment, the room was filled with the sound of zippers and excited chatter. Once the boys were occupied with the new paints in the other room, Arthur sat across from Claire at the small wooden table. "He never hated you. You know," Claire said softly, stirring a cup of tea, "even when things were the hardest. Even when we couldn't pay the heating bill, he would tell me that his father was a man who just got lost in the numbers. He told me that one day you'd find your way out of the woods." I was a fool, Arthur whispered. He looked at his hands. I thought I was building a legacy. I thought names on buildings were what mattered. I didn't realize that a legacy is something you breathe into people, not something you carve into stone. Julian knew that, Claire said. He spent every day of his life making sure those boys knew they were loved. That's why they aren't bitter. They don't know how to be bitter. They only know how to miss him. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter. He told me he was using my foundation to help people. He was donating his own money to my fund just to make sure I did the right thing. Why didn't he just ask me for help? Claire smiled sadly. Because Julian knew that if he asked for money, you would have given him a check and told him to go away. But if he guided your heart, he might get his father back. He wasn't trying to save himself, Arthur. He was trying to save you. Arthur sat in silence, the weight of that truth settling over him. He realized that Julian's secret wasn't a trick or a hidden bank account. It was a masterclass in redemption. Julian had spent years playing a long game, not for profit, but for the soul of a man who had forgotten he had one. I want to help, Arthur said, his voice firm now. Not just with the boys. I want to take over the youth center. I want to make sure you never have to work a double shift again. I want to be the man he thought I was. Claire reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her hand was rough from work, but her touch was steady. You don't have to buy our love, Arthur. You just have to be here. That's all he ever wanted. For the next few hours, Arthur didn't talk about business. He listened. He listened to stories about Julian's favorite jokes. He learned that Sam wanted to be an astronaut and that Leo had a talent for music. He looked at the drawings on the fridge and realized that Julian had been an artist. After all, he had painted a beautiful life with very little color to start with. As evening fell, Arthur stood up to leave. He felt lighter than he had in years. As he walked toward the door, Leo ran up to him and handed him a piece of paper. It was a drawing of a large tree with deep roots and many branches. That's our family, Leo said. Dad said the roots are the people who came before us, and the branches are us. He said the roots have to stay strong so the branches can reach the sun. Arthur looked at the drawing, his eyes blurring. He tucked it into his coat pocket, right next to his son's letter. I'll be back tomorrow, Arthur promised. We're going to the park. I hear there's a math test we need to celebrate. As he walked down the stairs and out into the cool night air, Arthur didn't call his driver. He decided to walk a few blocks. He watched the people passing by, the workers, the parents, the dreamers. For the first time, he didn't see them as statistics or obstacles. He saw them as neighbors. He saw them as people Julian had loved. He knew he couldn't bring Julian back. He couldn't erase the 12 years of silence. But as he looked up at the stars, he felt a strange sense of peace. The millionaire had finally found a secret that was worth more than his entire empire. So clear it looked like it had been scrubbed clean. Arthur stood in his bedroom, looking at his reflection in the mirror. For decades he had dressed like he was going into battle. High-collared shirts, silk ties that felt like nooses, and cufflinks made of cold gold. But today he reached for a soft wool sweater and a pair of trousers he hadn't worn in years. He didn't look like a tycoon. He looked like a man who was finally comfortable in his own skin. He spent the first few hours of the day at the Sterling Hope Fund office. It wasn't the usual stiff meeting. He had invited the staff of the youth center, the people Julian had worked with, to sit in the plush, leather chairs usually reserved for billionaire investors. He listened to them talk about the leaky roof, the lack of art supplies, and the kids who came there just because it was the only place they felt safe. I don't want to report on the cost, Arthur told them, leaning forward. I want to know how fast we can turn that place into a sanctuary. I want it to have the best music room in the city. I want a library that never runs out of books. And I want a mural on the front wall. A big one. One of the younger teachers looked at him with wide eyes. A mural of what, sir? Arthur felt a lump in his throat. A tree, with deep roots and branches that reached the sun? After the meeting, Arthur headed back to the apartment building. He didn't wait in the car this time. He walked up the stairs, and when Claire opened the door, He didn't feel like a stranger. He felt like he was coming home. The boys were already waiting by the door. Their new coats zipped up to their chins. They spent the afternoon at the park, just like Julian had promised. Arthur sat on a wooden bench, watching Leo and Sam run across the grass. He watched them fall, get back up, and laugh until they were breathless. Success wasn't a number in a bank account. It was the sound of a child's laughter echoing in the open air as the sun began to set. Casting a golden glow over the trees, Arthur took the boys to the youth center. It was a humble building nestled between a grocery store and a library. But to Arthur, it looked like a cathedral. He stood in the lobby, looking at the photos on the walls. There was Julian, smiling in almost every one of them. In one photo, Julian was teaching a group of kids how to paint. In another, he was handing out bowls of soup. Arthur realized that Julian hadn't just been living a modest life. He had been a king in this neighborhood. He had been a hero to people who didn't care about stock prices. "Grandpa, look," Sam shouted, pointing to a corner of the room. There was a small wooden box with a slit in the top. It was the donation box for the center. Next to it was a sign that said, "Every little bit helps us grow." Arthur reached into his wallet. He didn't pull out a $100 bill. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of change and a few crumpled $5 bills, the kind of money Julian used to send to the foundation. He dropped them into the box. The clink of the coins felt more satisfying than any wire transfer he had ever authorized. "Why are you putting that in there?" Leo asked, looking up at him. "You're rich, aren't you?" Arthur knelt down, so he was a level with the boy. "I used to think I was Leo, but your dad taught me that being rich is about what you give, not what you keep. I'm just trying to catch up to him." That evening, back at Claire's apartment, they all sat around the small kitchen table. Claire had made a simple stew, and the steam filled the room with warmth. They talked about the future, not about trust funds or inheritance, but about summer camps, piano lessons, and weekend trips to the mountains. "I want to ask you something, Claire," Arthur said, his voice quiet. "I have a big house. It's too big for one person. It's too quiet. I'm not asking you to move in for the money or the luxury. I'm asking because I want to wake up to the sound of these boys growing up. I want to be a family." She saw the sincerity in his eyes. She saw the man who had been humbled by his son's ghost. She didn't say yes right away, but she smiled, and for the first time. Arthur felt like the cold winter of his life was finally turning into spring. Months later, the grand reopening of the youth center took place. A large crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. There were families, local shopkeepers, and even some of Arthur's old business associates who looked a bit out of place but were moved by the atmosphere. Arthur stood on a small platform. He didn't have a prepared speech. He didn't need one. He looked out at the faces in the crowd, and then at the large mural on the wall behind him. It was a beautiful, sprawling tree. At the very bottom, hidden among the roots, were two small letters, JS. "This center," Arthur said into the microphone. His voice echoing through the street is named the Julian Sterling Center for Hope. But it wasn't built by me. It was built by a man who understood that the greatest secret to a happy life is a heart that stays open, even when it's hurting. My son taught me that. And today, I am just a student of his. As the ribbon was cut, Leo and Sam ran forward, leading the other children into the new building. Arthur stayed back for a moment, looking up at the sky. He felt a light breeze on his face, a soft touch that felt like a pat on the shoulder. He wasn't the millionaire who never expected a secret. He was a man who had been found by the truth. He walked into the building, following the sound of the children's voices, finally knowing exactly where he belonged. The two boys at the grave had cried for a father they lost. But in their grief, they had saved a grandfather who's already gone. The secret was out, the ledger was balanced, and for Arthur Sterling, the real work, the work of loving, had only just begun. The first snowfall of the year didn't feel like a cold interruption to Arthur. It felt like a fresh coat of paint on a world he was seeing clearly for the first time. It was early December, and for the first time in his life, Arthur wasn't looking at the weather report to see how it would affect his construction timelines or his stock portfolio. Instead, he was standing in the middle of a crowded, noisy department store holding a plastic lightsaber in one hand and a chemistry set in the other, feeling completely and utterly overwhelmed in a way that no board meeting had ever made him feel. He looked around at the other parents and grandparents. They were all rushing, looking tired and checking their watches. Usually, Arthur would have looked down on them for their lack of efficiency, but today he felt a strange sense of kinship with them. He was just another person trying to figure out how to make a child's face light up on Christmas morning. He realized that this was what Julian had been doing for years, saving pennies, planning surprises, and finding joy in the small things. Arthur eventually made his way to the checkout line. He wasn't using his corporate black card today. He used a simple debit card from a personal account he had set up. He wanted to feel the weight of the purchase. He wanted to know exactly what it cost to buy a smile. When he returned to the house, the large, one-silent mansion that was now filled with the chaotic energy of two growing boys, he didn't go into his office. He went straight to the kitchen. Claire was there, humming a song and stirring a pot of cocoa. The smell of cinnamon and chocolate had replaced the sterile scent of lemon polish and expensive leather that used to define the house. "You look like you've been through a war," Claire said with a laugh. Taking the bags from his hands, "I think a corporate takeover is easier than a toy store on a Saturday," Arthur admitted, sinking into a chair. He looked at her, and for a moment the weight of the past year hit him. "Claire, I've been thinking. We've spent so much time fixing the youth center and setting up the boys' school funds, but I want to do something more. Something that Julian would have done if he had my resources." Claire sat down across from him. She had become his rock, the person who kept him grounded when his old billionaire instincts tried to take over. "What are you thinking, Arthur?" "Julian said he was sending money to my foundation to teach it how to love. I want to take that a step further. I want to start a program called The Father's Hand. It's not just for kids. It's for fathers who have lost their way, like I did. I want to provide counseling, jobs, and a place where men can learn that being a provider is about more than just a paycheck." Claire reached out and squeezed his hand. He would love that. He spent so much of his time at the center just talking to the dads who felt like failures, because they couldn't buy the best shoes or the newest toys. He told them that their presence was the only thing that really mattered. They had been in the backyard trying to build a fort. "Grandpa, come see, we made a slide out of the old plywood in the garage." Sam shouted, his face bright red from the cold. Arthur stood up, his joints protesting slightly, but he didn't care. He followed them out into the garden. As he watched them play, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Near the edge of the property where a row of old pine trees stood, there was a small birdhouse. It was painted bright blue, and it looked exactly like the one Julian had described in his letter, the one he had made for the bird named Captain. Years ago, Arthur walked over to it. He realized that Julian must have come here years ago when the house was empty. He must have snuck onto the property just to leave a small piece of himself behind.
Ow.
Hoping that one day Arthur would find it, he felt a tear prick at his eye, but he didn't wipe it away. He looked back at the house, where the lights were glowing warm and gold against the twilight. He saw Claire in the window. He saw his grandsons laughing in the snow. He realized then that the millionaire's secret wasn't a hidden treasure or a final lesson in business. The secret was that love is a continuous act. It doesn't end with a letter or a funeral. It lives on in the birdhouses you build, the programs you start, and the way you hold a child's hand when they're scared. That night, after the boys were tucked in, Arthur sat in his library. He didn't turn on the computer. He didn't check the news. He just sat in the quiet, holding the drawing Leo had made of the tree with the deep roots. He realized that he wasn't just a root anymore. He was the soil, the water, and the sun. He was part of something that would outlive him. Arthur Sterling wasn't afraid of the future. He was finally a man who knew the value of everything because he finally knew the price of nothing. He closed his eyes and whispered a small thank you into the dark, certain that somewhere Julian was finally hearing him.